Long before winter became a season of warmth and celebration, there was a woman who ruled the cold itself, not as cruelty, but as order. She watched who worked, who cared, and who crossed the threshold between worlds. Her name was Holda, and she never belonged to just one story. Welcome back to Legends Reborn. This channel exists to look beyond the stories that survived, and to listen for what was reshaped, softened, or pushed into folklore when older truths became uncomfortable. Tonight, we return to a figure many people think they already know. A woman remembered as a character in a fairy tale, as a winter spirit, as a name whispered around the hearth. But Holda was never just a story meant for children. She did not disappear when belief changed. She adapted. And in the quiet weeks of winter, when the year itself seems to pause, her presence lingers closer than most realize. Tonight, we dive into the full legend of Holda, where she survives first as a story. Most people didn't meet her in carved myths or temple prayers, but in simple stories told close to the hearth, passed from one generation to the next, shaped more by habit than by any holy law. In those homes, she survives not as a distant goddess, but as the quiet figure people whisper about, not as Holda, but as Frau Holle. In those stories, the pattern is simple. A girl, pushed more by circumstance than by courage, falls into a well. She doesn't choose to go down, she slips, and that accident becomes a doorway into somewhere else. The world she lands in is not a place of terror, but a quiet, ordered realm that feels strange yet understandable. A place where everything still expects to be cared for. As she moves through this place, even the simplest things seem to wait for her. Bread resting in the oven as if it doesn't want to be forgotten, an apple tree bowing under the weight of its fruit, almost inviting her to reach up and help. Nothing in this world commands her or threatens her. It simply needs care. She answers that need because she notices, because she pays attention, and only after that does Holda appear. Holda appears as an old woman, but there is nothing fragile about her. Her presence has weight, a quiet kind of authority that doesn't need any display. She doesn't announce a trial or explain a test. By the time she speaks, the judgment is already in motion. While the girl works in her house, tending everything with calm, steady effort, Holda simply watches in silence. And when the moment comes to send her back, the reward feels like the natural result of all that care. Gold that falls over her not as a sudden miracle, but as the clear consequence of how she behaved in that other world. The second girl follows the same path, but not with the same attention. She walks past everything that needs help, treating this other world like a corridor to hurry through, instead of a place she owes anything to. Holda doesn't stop her or try to correct her. There is no scolding, only the quiet sense that choices carry their own weight. When the girl is finally sent home, what falls over her is not gold but heavy, clinging tar. A dark layer that stays on her skin, a visible record of how she moved through that realm. By that point, most people stop thinking about the story any further. It turns into a simple lesson about hard work and laziness, about good behavior bringing rewards, and bad behavior being exposed. But under that neat moral sits something older, something that keeps pushing through no matter how often the tale is trimmed down or retold in simpler terms. The well in this story is more than a backdrop, it's a boundary. It becomes a passage straight down between worlds, the kind of opening people imagined long before churches or stone walls, long before anyone wrote these tales down. Falling through it doesn't lead to fire or open judgment, but to responsibility. On the other side is a realm that mirrors the living world, yet strips away rank and excuses, leaving only how you actually behave. Holda's house is neither heaven nor hell, and it was never meant to be a place of punishment or rescue. It is a threshold, a quiet in-between space where your actions are the only thing that truly counts. In her realm, you are not judged for who you claim to be, but weighed by what you actually do when no one seems to be watching. That difference is subtle, but it changes the whole meaning of the story. Because once this story has settled into people's memory, Holda doesn't stay tied to a single well or a small cottage in the woods. She begins to appear in other places too, carried into the turning of the year and slowly woven into the rhythm of winter itself. People once said that when the snow began to fall, it was Holda at work, not raging like a storm goddess, not lashing out in anger, but simply tending to her duties. The snow was imagined as feathers shaken from a great unseen bed, a small household gesture stretched across the sky. Rain became the water she used for washing, and mist the smoke drifting from her chimney. In that way, the whole landscape turned into a kind of living home, quietly animated by the same steady, practical work the girl had been asked to do in her house. In these beliefs, winter is not just a time of cold, but a season of closeness, a time for spinning and mending indoors, while the world outside falls silent, when life finally slows enough for the other side to feel near. It is in this quiet stretch of the year, with the days dim and the work turned inward, that Holda's story deepens. In folk belief, Holda's care extends beyond spinning and household work. She also watches over children, especially those who never fully crossed into the world of the living. This includes infants who died too soon, and little ones who passed before they were named or fully welcomed by family and community. These souls were not seen as punished or cast out, they were gathered. In that role, Holda becomes less a judge and more a guardian, a quiet presence who receives those who cannot stay, but who should never simply disappear. There is a quiet grief inside this belief. It reflects a world where death was common and explanations were rare, so comfort had to live in symbols rather than in answers. In these stories, Holda does not save the children or bring them back to their families. She simply gives them a place to belong. And in some tellings, she does more than watch over them. She moves with them, traveling at the edges of the living world. During the darkest nights of the year, when the old calendar was fading and the new one had not yet settled in, people spoke of a procession crossing the sky. They described it as a kind of wild hunt, but not one led by warriors or kings. This was not Odin racing past with fallen heroes at his side. Holda's host moved differently. It was said to carry women and children, and the dead who had never been fully claimed by ritual or memory, drifting overhead during the 12 nights, the days between years when ordinary rules loosened and the line between worlds grew thin. This was not a march of glory, but a passage, a quiet reminder that the dead still traveled and that someone watched over their movement. In these stories, Holda is not savage, yet she is not gentle in the way later religions would imagine mercy. She is steady. She keeps order at a boundary most people barely dared to name. By the time Christianity reached these regions, the stories about Holda were already old, too deeply rooted in daily life to erase, too familiar to simply replace. They slipped out of open belief and survived instead as folklore and fairy tale, folded into seasonal customs. This was the version people were allowed to keep, an old woman in a winter story, a name spoken softly, often without anyone realizing how much history stood behind it. Even in that reduced form, her outline stays clear, a woman with authority, judging behavior rather than belief, guarding thresholds, and growing strongest when the year itself feels weakest. This is not where Holda's story begins, but it is where she endures. What lingers in folklore often hides what history once tried to dismantle. By the early Middle Ages, stories of Holda were no longer confined to warm hearths and quiet winter evenings. They began to surface, indirectly, in church records, not as legends to be cherished, but as examples in texts that tried to separate approved Christian practice from older local customs that still persisted. The Canon Episcopi is one of the clearest recorded traces of this belief. Framed as a guide for clergy, it warns about women who say they travel at night in the company of a powerful female leader. They claim to leave their bodies behind, to ride through the dark, to follow a woman whose authority reaches beyond the walls of the home. The text labels this as false vision and wrongdoing, something to be rejected. Yet by setting out these warnings in detail, it also ends up preserving a glimpse of the stories people were still telling. Across different regions and centuries, the pattern in these texts stays surprisingly similar. Women said to move together at night, not in wild disorder, but as part of a kind of procession, led by a figure who is distinctly not male. The name of that leader shifts with place and time. Diana in one account, Herodias in another, and in some traditions, Holda herself. Yet the structure of the belief remains the same. The writers seem less concerned with random chaos than with the idea of a feminine authority operating outside the channels they recognized and controlled. In that light, Holda begins to look less like a harmless winter figure and more like a presence that must be watched and contained. At this stage, she is no longer only the figure who rewards steady work or gathers lost children into her care. In these new portrayals, she becomes a rider in the night, a presence said to lure women away from obedience, even a kind of shadow queen, placed over those now marked as heretics. The same traits that once defined her as protector and judge are turned on their head, so that authority begins to look like danger, and movement through the night is recast as corruption. Often, This is how a figure is demonized, not by wiping her from memory, but by slowly changing what her actions are believed to mean. By the time early witchcraft accusations begin to appear, Holda is already there in the background. Women are charged with flying through the air, slipping out of their homes at night, meeting in places no one else can see. These images don't arise from nowhere. They grow out of older beliefs that never completely faded. Holda's name shifts into Striga Holda, and the once helpful Frau Holla turns into a figure used more as a warning than a guide. Yet even through all of this, something in her story refuses to be completely flattened. Even in texts that speak against her, she is rarely shown as a force of chaos. She does not call for pure destruction. She leads, sets things in motion, and holds to a pattern that feels older than the systems later writers tried to impose. That steady, ordered quality is one reason later scholars found it so difficult to pin her down. Jacob Grimm, writing in the 19th century, tried to trace Holda back to a pre-Christian goddess. He followed language, customs, and folk tales as far as he could, looking for a single point of origin behind all the scattered stories. His work became hugely influential, but it was also shaped by the mood of his time. Romantic, tied to ideas about nation and roots, and sometimes a little too quick to draw firm conclusions where the evidence was blurred. Modern scholars tend to be more careful in how they speak about her. They rarely describe Holda as a neatly defined goddess with clear temples and formal priesthoods. Instead, they see her as something more spread out, a presence shaped by many layers of belief over a long stretch of time. She may well have roots before Christianity, and she almost certainly reaches back further than the medieval world that tried to narrow her down. What can be followed with any confidence is not a full life story, but a role that keeps returning in different forms. Holda comes into focus in moments where life feels fragile, a hard winter, a birth that could go either way, the loss of a child, or the kind of daily work that quietly decides whether a family gets through the season. She is tied to places and tasks that carry real weight, even if they are rarely praised or remembered. When you look at her across all these settings, a clearer pattern begins to emerge. Holda does not carry this role alone. Across Northern Europe, other figures appear with a similar kind of authority. They are often described as women who receive the dead rather than sitting in judgment over them, and who guard thresholds instead of distant heavens. Rather than promising riches after death, they offer a sense of continuity beyond loss. In the Norse tradition, that place is held by Hel. It is still important to be careful here. Holda is not Hel, their stories are not the same, and the cultures that form them are different in many ways. Even so, the place they occupy within their worlds follows a pattern that clearly connects them. They both preside over realms reached by going down rather than rising up, over places from which there is no return. Their doors are open to those who never fit into heroic tales, the very young, and those who die without glory or even a name. Neither rules by handing out punishments or rewards. Their power lies in simply being the place where these lives are gathered and held. And if you want to spend more time with that pattern, there is already a full episode on Hel waiting for you here on the channel. What matters here is less her exact identity, and more the thread that runs through all these stories. Figures like Holda endure because the role they fill never really disappears. Cultures can reshape their official beliefs, but death stays close, grief keeps returning, and people still look for somewhere to imagine their loss going. Holda remains in that space, answering that need quietly, without spectacle. She does not hold out the promise that everyone will rise again, and she does not threaten anyone with endless fire. Instead, she offers a kind of steady shape where chaos might otherwise take over. That is why she survives in pieces, turning up in winter customs and old stories, and even in the language of later accusations that reveal more than they intend. Some historians have tried to reclaim her as an ancient goddess, while church writers have treated her as a threat. But folklore has carried her quietly between those two views. Through all of this, her core remains the same. A female authority at the threshold, a keeper of what cannot stay, yet still must be received. A presence that feels strongest when certainty begins to fail. This is not a role that fades easily. The world keeps finding new ways to recreate it, even when the name attached to it is forgotten. And when Holda is approached through surviving sources instead of living belief, a different outline begins to emerge. She does not stand out as a neatly defined goddess with one clear origin or a single official cult built around her. What we see instead are traces, a similar role appearing in different places, familiar images and story elements that keep returning even as names and settings change. Taken together, these patterns do not form a strict belief system, but they do reveal a role that people kept returning to because they still needed it. Holda shows herself most clearly in moments when life is shifting. She is close in winter, when daily routines slow down and the turn of the year feels thin and uncertain. She is present in the home, in the kind of ongoing work that keeps people alive but rarely gets praised. She appears again in stories of children who die before they are fully welcomed by family, community, or ritual, when there is no clear place to put that grief. In all of these settings, she does not arrive as someone who changes the rules, but as a steady figure inside a pattern that is already there, holding it together when it might otherwise come apart. The places tied to her follow the same pattern. Instead of abstract symbols, they are real locations people once knew as risky or liminal. Wells, high ground, the edges of forests, stretches of water that had to be crossed. Falling into a well, entering a mountain path, stepping into deep water, each of these moments marks a shift from one state into another. Holda is not linked to the first step of that journey, but to the point where coming back is no longer guaranteed. This kind of consistency is one reason many scholars are careful not to pin her down too tightly. When people try to rebuild Holda as a sharply defined, pre-Christian goddess, they often have to lean on later sources that already come to us through layers of folktale. But simply treating her as nothing more than a storybook figure also fails to explain how deep and persistent her role has been. What we can really trace across time is not a neat line of development, but a steady thread that keeps reappearing. Holda does not gather more power as the centuries pass, and her territory does not steadily widen. She stays linked to the same kinds of concerns, whether people name her or not. The daily work that keeps a household going, and the way communities absorb deaths that arrive without clear reason or meaning. Seen from that angle, her persistence becomes easier to recognize. Figures who carry these kinds of roles are rarely wiped out altogether. Their image can be softened, twisted, or pushed into the realm of folktale, but they tend to stay in some form. The role itself keeps rising to the surface, even when the surrounding religious ideas change. Holda is one version of that pattern, shaped by the landscapes, fears, and everyday structures of the Germanic world. You can see similar roles in many other traditions, each shaped by its own landscape and fears. In some, that presence watches over a realm reached by going down, rather than standing trial. In others, she is the one who receives the dead who never fit into tales of heroism or glory. What links these figures is not that they are the same being, but that they answer the same recurring need. Holda's stories rarely push toward clear extremes. She is not framed as purely kind or purely cruel. People in her tales may be rewarded or harmed, but these results feel like the natural outcome of how they behaved in a particular setting, rather than a heavy moral sentence being handed down. The focus stays on what someone actually does within her world, not on what they claim to believe or what they meant to do. It's a way of telling the story that belongs to an older layer of thought, from before later ideas about sin and redemption began to dominate. When Christian authorities met these traditions, they rarely wiped them out. More often they changed the way they were described. Journeys through the night were written off as deception or false vision, and stories of women leading such movements were turned into signs of danger. The older roles were left in place, but given new labels and motives. Even in these critical accounts, the basic shape of the older pattern is still easy to recognize. You can see the effect of that reframing in the many faces Holda is given over time. In some accounts, she looks like a caretaker, in others a stern household judge, elsewhere a figure who rides by night or is named as a witch. These are not separate characters, but different ways of looking at the same underlying role, each shaped by the concerns of its own period. Much of what survives in folklore marks the parts of that role that could never be fully taken into official religious teaching, and so had to live on in story instead. Holda never becomes a universal presence. She stays tied to particular regions and seasons, woven into certain customs and specific times of year. That narrow focus is part of why she lasts so long. She doesn't try to stand alongside the great, all-encompassing belief systems. Instead, she settles into the gaps they leave open, quietly inhabiting the parts of life they pay least attention to. If you focus on where she appears, instead of trying to lock down what she is, the pattern becomes clearer. Holda shows up wherever keeping things going matters more than having an answer, where loss has to be carried and managed rather than explained away. In those spaces, order is held together close to home, without needing to lean on distant authority. This may be one reason she stands out most clearly in winter customs. The end of the year has often been treated as an in-between time, when ordinary life slows and people become more careful about how they act and what they take on. In those pauses, figures who watch over thresholds tend to come into focus. Holda's endurance has less to do with active belief than with repetition. As long as people keep moving through the same kinds of transitions, they will keep needing the same kinds of roles. And the stories built around her linger not because they persuade, but because they still fit the world as it is lived. What remains, then, is not a fixed teaching to accept or refuse, but a figure whose outline has proved difficult to erase. Not because she demands remembrance, but because the space she fills has never truly disappeared. This is Legends Reborn, where the past still breathes. Holda doesn't leave us with simple answers. She lingers in the quieter corners of history, in the places where the record grows thin and certainty was never promised. How you carry her from here is up to you. Maybe, for you, she feels like an echo of older belief. For someone else, she might be a figure shaped by the need to survive. For others, she may simply be a story that stayed because it still fits the world we live in. If this story stayed with you, I'd genuinely like to hear what stood out. Maybe there was a detail that caught you off guard, or a version you once heard that came close to this one. Maybe it stirred a question you're still turning over. If you feel like sharing that in the comments, know that it helps these legends keep moving and changing, instead of staying locked on the page. And if there is another forgotten figure you feel deserves this kind of careful telling, you're welcome to mention that in the comments, whether it's a specific name or just someone you'd like to see brought back into focus. Your voice really does help shape where this journey goes next. Thank you for staying with me. Until the next story, may the old paths remain visible, even in winter.